much is clear. And it is yet to be seen how this will all come out. I believe it will be very traumatic for many Americans to see a history that is one-third. Here is what the slaves who came into these colonies experienced, what their lives were like, how they were enslaved. It was very interesting to me. When I read the treaty, I actually, the Pamunkey and the Mattaponi and the King of England's, the Indians, first of all, knew that they had been decimated. The Indians had attacked the fort at Jamestown and killed 200 colonists. But they also helped them survive by providing food and so on in the early period. The history of this is, I don't know exactly what interpretation to accept. There's many truths, plural truths. So I don't know how they will settle it, but you can be sure it will be various. It will be competitive. And what the effect will be, I'm not sure. But it's very good. And I'm waiting myself to see. And one of the advantages of being a mediator and special consultant is I'm getting an early preview of much of this by the Indians showing me what they would like and so on. Okay, now, what does this have to do with intercultural negotiation or mediation? How did I come to be involved? I'm going to try and make it as less legalistic and administrative as possible. But here is the story, the best I can give it to you. When the permit was requested by these governments that wanted to build this reservoir, it was strongly opposed by environmental organizations who did not want to lose the wetlands and who felt that the drawing out of water from these rivers and then putting it in the reservoir and piping it to another location would threaten the fish runs. It would allow more development than would be advisable, because the land that surrounds this reservoir, you understand, will be very valuable for housing sites and for tourism. And this is largely owned by large corporations, largely forest corporations that own trees and have traditionally exploited the forestry for their resources, but now know that subdivisions are more valuable than trees. So the Indian tribes and the environmental organizations, including many of them that you would know, the names, they challenged the process through what we call the National Environmental Policy Act. And this, we say NEPA, N-E-P-A. And the NEPA requirement that is most important is what we call the Environmental Impact Statement. The person requesting a permit to build a reservoir must apply for the permit. They must study the hydrology, the land, all of the consequences and activities that they would undertake to build this reservoir. The Environmental Policy Act, however, requires also political participation and opportunities for the opponents of the project to argue that this is inadequate, that it is not complete, and that you should not build the project because the environmental consequences are much greater than the economic benefits that the sponsors think. But most of those battles have been lost by the environmentalists. And I am aware of this. I was briefly involved, this was 20 years ago, in the early stages of this for negotiations, and then I was gone for a long time. The agency of the federal government that says this is now sufficiently studied, we know it, and we have now made a decision of whether to build it or not, was to be made by the Army. We call it the Army Corps of Engineers. It's a very powerful organization. It is the organization that built the levees, and not very well, down in New Orleans. When you think of water projects in the United States, dams, harbors, dredging, you think of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And they are required to say yes or no. And in this case, they said yes, it's okay. So now, the permit actually had been granted, and this is why it's kind of complicated. There is another law, and this is where the cultural issue comes in. It's called the National Historic Preservation Act. And it has a similarity to the Environmental Act, and it says that you must study the cultural impacts of development, highways, dams, whatever, on the traditional cultural properties of prehistoric peoples. Well, this is generally not a big issue in the United States because the tribes have mostly been, they're very low populations. Very few things in the American East are affected by this. Out west, where there's large reservations of Indians on the plains and in the deserts and in the western mountains, yes, because there's lots of federal land and people will do some of the work like I've been doing. Okay, so at this point, the Corps of Engineers said we will grant the permit subject to the following. You must rate the hunting, fishing, living area of these tribes. These tribes are opposed to the reservoir. We will hold the permit back until you have negotiated successfully a cultural mitigation package. That's why I've been retained. Then the Corps of Engineers and the applicant, which is these governments that want to build the reservoir, and the three tribes, then I went and met with them to see whether I would be acceptable to them, particularly to the Indian. The Corps of Engineers knows me, I have degrees, and yes, he knows about history, and he's done this, so fine. And the applicant organizations were not so favorable towards me, but they wanted someone who had some experience and who they felt could gain the confidence of the Indians. I met with the Indians, and they said yes. So they then agreed that they would retain me. I wrote a contract with the city saying, you pay me the money, but you cannot tell me what to do. These are my clients. You give them money, I will assist them in negotiating effectively with you. I will help them get expertise. I will help them organize their negotiating positions. But I will be their, I am at their call. The money comes from you. The contract keeps me at arm's length. They will be my client, and I must work with them. So I am in the first year only of this process that will probably go 3 or 4 or even 5 years. I don't know if I will live that long, but the process will go that long. And so we are in the midst then of trying to determine exactly what it is that they would like to do. What is it that you want? The first thing is, like archaeologists. But you understand that when they build this reservoir, they're going to have to dig up huge amounts. They're going to have to build across this land pipes for pipes to go in and pumps. And so there will be a great amount of land disturbance that is in the area in which they have traditionally fished and hunted and clammed and oystered and farmed. And thus they must negotiate with them. But how much? Where is it? The legal term is, where is the area of potential effect? Has the unfortunate acronym of APE. But, and so we are in the process of saying it is this whole area. The Indians say there is no, it's not just the pipeline, it's not just where the pump is or the withdrawal. This is our traditional land. And when you start, the archaeologists are now going to be required to go in and do these studies, and if they find remains or artifacts or anything, they have to document that. So the first thing the Indians say, we want to be involved in that process, because archaeologists are interested in this, always study it from the university, but they don't know about our plants, and they don't know about our sacred places, and they don't know our oral traditions. We want to be involved. And of course, you would expect from me, yes, of course. So how much money will they be paid for their children to become better educated about their archaeology, their history by a company? This is a big thing, I think a good thing. And so they will do that. They will not spend so much of it. They each have about, excuse me for interrupting myself, you figure that each tribe will get about $100,000 each. That's kind of partly written, partly unwritten. So then they can spend it. You tell me how to spend it. But I actually have the purse strings, we'd say. They say we want to pay our young teenagers away from that are coming back, a wage of $20 an hour, and they will go to the archaeological sites and they will watch what's happening and make sure that if there's remains of our ancestors, that these are protected and replaced and honored. Whatever, I suspect a check, because the money is under my control. The second thing, and the most interesting thing, is that there is such a thin history of any kind of cultural mitigation package. And that is this: how much money will they accept as a basis of an agreement to say, yes, we agree now that you can proceed, that we are satisfied that the remains of our ancestors will be respected and retained. The property that is discovered will be either curated, that is to say, they will take care of it and put it in a museum or in some appropriate place. And when we want it, it can come to our reservation and we can display it in our own place for people. So this is the issue of how much will that be, and how will we justify it, and how will the money be used? Well, I can tell you this much right now, that we're in a very preliminary stage, and these tribes do not agree. The chief of the Pamunkey and the chief of the Mattaponi are pretty good friends, but they have quite different attitudes about how to deal with the white man. The chief of the Mattaponi they have lawyers who are environmental lawyers from the university in Washington called Georgetown, and they also have a assistant from a national organization called American Indian Legal Organization, and they are going to challenge the permit for the reservoir in the federal courts. And it will very likely go to the U.S. Supreme Court, because there is no law in America respecting the status of treaties that were drawn before the Constitution of the United States was written. And they will argue in this court suit, I have it here with me, and they may succeed, is that even though the United States government did not exist when this treaty was written, the United States government must accept and recognize these tribes and their land as being sovereign, and that they must protect these Indians and their traditional lands and areas from this reservoir, or from the activities that are required to mitigate the reservoir, which is to dig up more land to build the new wetlands, to replace the old wetlands. So that's the story. Is I already used all my time?
The
time is off.
Time is off, but I was checking in the other room when they start, so I thought we can at least have 10 minutes.
Oh, of course, I've talked too much. But you can see it's a very long story. I didn't really go into the cultural side, but why don't I just, would you like to moderate and...
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please, are there any questions, comments?
Yeah, it's a very interesting case. I'm working in South America with indigenous peoples.
Really? In what country?
Paraguay, Argentina, and Bolivia, and Brazil.
That's where the real action is.
And I wonder, in your case, it is a land issue, it is a cultural issue, it is an ecological issue, and it's an archaeological issue. Now, as I understood what you are dealing in mediation in your specific case is reduced to the part of the archaeological impact on the land and the mitigation of this case. I wonder whether your case is connected somehow with the court decision.
Yes.
And your role in this, your role as a mediator within this process, connecting two quite conflicted issues, I assume.
I hope you will join Ian and I for a cup of coffee, because I have also been working in Panama. As you probably know, there's a proposal to add a third set of locks to the Panama Canal. To do that, you'd have to flood huge new areas in order to provide the water for the lock system and displace thousands of indigenous people there. And I was down, okay. That is much more interesting and challenging in true mediation sense than what I'm doing. But to answer your specific question, there is the environmental organizations and the Indian tribes are cooperating in the lawsuit. They're tightly bound. And they don't care how they win. If they win on the challenge to the environmental permits, which is possible, that will be fine. But the Indian treaty issue is probably the one issue that they think they have a better chance on if they can get the U.S. Supreme Court to say, you must intervene on behalf of that treaty right, which precedes the environmental laws and others which have not been successful. They want to stop the reservoir. And it will play out, but in the meantime, you see, the reason that they're going ahead is, if they lose, we will have a better package and more compensation by the time that they start the digging. So that's the answer.
Perhaps instead of the pumping, water.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm from Canada, and some of my colleagues work closely with the First Nations, and,
Of course.
and unfortunately they've given up on a lot of negotiations because...
The Indians have. We call them the first people.
Well, First Nations.
First Nation. They have given up on negotiations?
Well, some of them have. I mean, I don't know if it's been in the news where you are, but Caledonia in Ontario, there has been a standoff and barricade again, as there was more than 10 years ago in Quebec, where which an escalation led to the calling out of, the possibility of calling out the Canadian Army. So, the strategies about how far you can get in the courts, there's a lot of cynicism developing because there's not a consensus, in fact, on what the right process is, and
I'm
the
sure.
white man's courts
I'm
are
sure.
not necessarily seen as the place where you can trust the outcome. But that's actually just as a preamble. Because from the cultural side, what I find interesting, what you described, in Canada, most First Nations, there are still over 60 living languages. So the kind of closeness to the sense of history and cultural
They still have
identity,
their culture.
it's still much more vibrant. Nevertheless, there is a kind of struggle for identity, or struggle for acknowledgement from the surrounding environment that things like re-ethnicization or renaissance of culture or reconstructing it.
We say living culture.
The way you want to do it, is that is a legitimate process. Because there are some voices that say, well, you lost it. You are now like us. This is all make-believe. You're just creating a kind of...
There's a lot of that in this book.
A Disneyland of First Nations history and a sort of new mythology. So I just wonder how you see that, and from where you stand.
Could just collect a few comments and then use some voices.
Sure, but would you like me to respond briefly to this?
Okay.
Okay. The answer is that I think the most interesting thing is that the whole the Indian culture from Latin America, Bolivia, Venezuela, Panama, Central America, our own Western Indians, less so with the Indian tribes that I'm dealing with, and up into Canada is something very powerful going on. And the issues of cultural identity and whether, if there is a living language and a living culture that's viable, then how shall we support it? These people, I think, are caught up in that myth. They go to the powwows. They go to the powwows and they hear other tribes, and they have a certain ideology then, and then they question whether it will really work, because hardly any of these people, they've lost their language. I will close with this. That the anthropologist Ruth Benedict said in some of her early work that an Indian chief told her that at the creation, all cultures were given a clay cup, and our clay cup is broken. In other words, the dominance of the white man and of European culture is so pronounced that what do you do then? As distinct from where the cup may be really cracked, or where there is room for still cultural advance. That's much more.
Can they glue the cup back together?
Can they put it back together? I think that's the big question, and it depends very much on where you are and where the people are, what the politics and economics of development is. That's what's fascinating. Mine is just a kind of a sidebar in importance, but it's fascinating, and that's why. But the bigger issues are the two, and also I think perhaps in New Zealand, where the culture there is still viable and you don't know what yet will come of it. Thank you for.
They will have two more comments. I would say you say two comments and then you have the last word and then we have to stop.
Yeah, just one observation which I find interesting, that coming from a European perspective, we have to learn that in intercultural conflicts, when they are within a state, it can be very helpful that you usually only find the solution on a more individual level. So you're leaving the nation or the culture and going back, what does it mean for you as a person?
Yeah.
Which is pretty easy here in Europe. However, what I see from your perspective is that at the time where these cultures try to re-establish and have a renaissance of their culture which they have lost, you have to find a solution on a more individual, because that's where you only can find it. So it could be that the way you have to do the mediation process by stressing the intercultural issues will make it more escalate the whole conflict rather than de-escalate, because mediation could become a tool just to re-establish the culture.
Now I have to dominate because other people also want to. And you are the next, and class, a rule is there to be broken, so you're the very last one. But you were.
No.
Oh, that's even better.
Question. I perceive the one side of the tribes rather than mediating.
Yeah, it's an unusual situation.
He also wants to say one.
It's a short question. When you talk about mitigation and compensation, it's always money. Is no other way mitigate or compensation?
Well, it is usually, money is an element always. The money may be used to build a federation or a trust fund, or it may be used in other ways to allow them to display their culture to visitors. But money is clearly the biggest thing. I think I would predict that somewhere between $5 and $10 million will be given by the permittee to these tribes to do with what they want before the negotiations conclude.
How much?
Somewhere between $5 and $10 million.
Which is not
Well, that
how much is the whole project?
Pardon me?
How much of the whole project with the water?
Ooh, hundreds of millions. I don't even know. So it's yet what I'm saying. But nevertheless, they were unsuccessful in doing this. I was not brought in until the previous negotiations on this matter broke down, and that they just couldn't communicate. And the Indians are telling me, here's why we were not successful before. They did not listen to us. They did not understand. They are not trustworthy. That kind of thing. So it wasn't that they did not accept the bill, the proposal for the Indians previously, which was much less than I'm saying it will be. They'll pay a higher price now. And partly because the political timing is so good for them. The political timing. Much more. And I think they're beginning to understand that. So that's somewhere between that amount. But going back to your question, you see, as a mediator, we're so used to trying to find a way to fit, we say neutral or independent or impartial or open-minded to improve the communication. You see, when there's a cultural thing, a cultural barrier, as opposed to just interpersonal or a difference of interest or economic interest or political territory or whatever, we are used to that, right? And it's a little bit of mystery as to how you should work, not only because of the particular situation which we have, but it's challenging intellectually to say, here's the way I look at it. Is it cultural? I like the metaphor of the lens, which the anthropologists, who largely are responsible for creating this concept of cultural relativism. That is, that it isn't race or biology, the evolution is largely one of culture in the human experience. And thus the idea of the lens that you grind yourself, that I am on this side of that lens, and they are on this side of this lens that they have ground for themselves. And I am supposed to go from my home culture to somewhere between them and understand both lenses, even though I'm from one. And this is, of course, the issue that anthropology faces all the time. And, of course, when the white man first came to Virginia, He had no questions about the nature of the chain of being. The Brazilians, the Maoris, the Americans were savages. They were low down on the cultural chain, and that we Western Europeans were at the top. It was it was cultural dominance. Christianity, Western science and technology and beliefs, rationalism, and then these people. Now, if you look at it, it goes kind of on its side. Instead of being a clear hierarchy, we are saying, let us look at them as parallel and try to, I'm looking at the world, and that you must even look back at your home culture as a form of criticism. Look what our home culture does not do that they do. Now, I'll confess, as an environmentalist, there is no greater affinity in American ethnography than between the Indian as tragic hero, as environmentalist, as close to nature, and as being someone in close contact with the gods and with that. Environmentalists like that. I like that. So that one of the most interesting things is that out of this will arise not only an existing coalition between the Indians and the environmentalists, which we already have, but it will lend cultural credibility to a lot of what the sustainabilists, or those of us who think that we must live with less consumption, with more respect for nature, for more idea of limitations and of balance. That's what attracted me, because it's not like they're separate categories. It is like they are different layers, and how that will work out will be politically significant, I believe. What will happen? And you should read your newspapers. As this Jamestown thing, you watch. One final thing. We always say the American experience is we are a nation of immigrants and we are a melting pot. That has been the American belief. Now we say no melting pot. We must be a mosaic or some other metaphor. No longer the melting pot. That is a politically significant fact of the home culture which I represent.
Life.
Thank you.
With all the challenges, all these people, you included with me.
Thank you, good. Thank you.